As the 2000s progressed, the fighting game genre would see a renaissance. Having made it out of the doldrums of the early decade, new advances in console technology pushed the limits of what was possible. Developers were able to make games with more content and more elaborate graphics and gameplay while still keeping the essence of what made the genre popular to begin with. When online gameplay became more accessible and widespread, it will forever change the way that players would experience these games. Not only were fighting games making their way back into the mainstream, but they would cultivate an all-new generation of fans. New fighting games would spring up, earning their place in fighting game history, while older franchises would continue to reinvent themselves, appealing to audiences both old and new. Throughout it all, however, there would still be one king of fighters. When we last left off, the heroes of King of Fighters had just defeated Nest in King of Fighters 2001, but you already knew that. At the same time, SNK themselves underwent bankruptcy and re-emerged as Playmore, but again you already knew that. In 2002 they released a Dream Match entry which took place outside of continuity, just like King of the Fighters 98 from several years earlier. Again, you already knew that. Thus, 2003 would be the start of an all-new saga. This new saga was known as the Tales of Ash. But you already knew that. This was named as such because it would introduce King of Fighters' newest hero, Ash Crimson. Although if you were to observe his actions throughout the next few games, I'm not sure if you would apply that label to him. Anyway, this installment of the King of Fighters Retrospective is dedicated to the first part of the Ash Crimson saga, with King of Fighters 2003. After mentioning him in the past two installments, it feels good to finally discuss him in full. You've waited long enough for this video, so let's hop right in and meet our newest hero. Ash Crimson was designed by SNK illustrator Tatsuhiko Kanaoka, better known as Falcoon. It was clear that he was different from other King of Fighters characters, or even other fighting game characters in general. He wore bright red with a feminine look and hairstyle. He's what people would call non-binary, and he didn't conform to any gender norms. Of course, nowadays he'd be called woke, but I'm getting away from myself. Whereas Kyo and K- were mostly heroic and masculine, even if K- was more of an anti-hero, Ash was feminine, and his actions throughout the story arc painted him and his motivations in a somewhat ambiguous light, if not outright villainous at times. According to Falcoon, Ash was designed this way to make players feel bad about cheering him on. As far as his fighting style, it made use of agility with a mixture of charging moves and projectiles. His specials involved charging, so he was a good player for players who like to play defense. Ash would be joined by two additional characters, Duo Lan and Shen Wu. Duo Lan was a member of the Flying Brigands, the group of assassins featured in past King of Fighters games, with Lin debuting in 2000 and Ron appearing as a side character throughout various entries. Speaking of Ron, Duo Lan is actually his son, and he's on a mission to kill him. Unlike Lin and Ron, Duo Lan has a more handsome pretty boy-like design, as opposed to Ron and Lin's creepy and mysterious looks. Duo Lan had moves that utilized his snake fighting style. He was a bit tricky to play with, but he could become useful once you got his moves down. He had a teleport which was an effective part of his arsenal, so both him and Ash could play defense and they could keep players on their toes. Shen Wu was a brawler from China, who wore bright colors and fought with a boxing style. He's depicted as rowdy and always looking for a fight. He kinda reminds me of Balrog from Street Fighter with the way that you could charge some of his attacks. Still, he was much faster and more agile, and it was easy to use his moveset to lay the hurt on an opponent. His moveset kind of felt generic, but his character design really made him stand out. Together, these three would form the hero team, and they would kick off a brand new saga for the King of Fighters. And with a new saga came changes, both for the longtime roster and the gameplay. It would be the gameplay perhaps that would see the biggest change for the series. In 2002, the teams that went back to 3 vs 3 from the 4-on-4 striker system in the NES saga. In 2003, while it will retain the 3-on-3 format, the matches would now be tag battles instead of elimination rounds, similar to Marvel vs. Capcom 2. SNK dubbed this system the Tag Shift System, and this would completely change the dynamic of the game, giving players new strategy options and forcing them to rethink their playstyle. Whenever a character tagged out, they will recover their health over a period of time until they were called back in from the sidelines. There is a short cooldown period when you change your character before you could tag out again, so things didn't get as chaotic as they did in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Still, matches were faster and more unpredictable than previous King of Fighters games. In addition to the tag shift system, the player you selected first would be designated as the leader, and they will be able to use a 2-meter desperation move known as the leader desperation move. This added a further layer of strategy to the game. This spirit of change will be reflected in the cast too. Let's start with Team Fatal Fury. In past King of Fighters games, Team Fatal Fury would usually be made up of Terry and Andy Bogard along with Joe Higashi. The most variation came during the NES saga, but this would only see either Mai Shiranu or Blue Mary added to the team as the 4th member. This time, Team Fatal Fury would consist of Terry Bogard, Joe Higashi, and Taizak. Taizak was a wrestler in a bird mask who made his debut in Garou, Mark of the Wolves. He was a grapple-heavy character and even had a move similar to Zangief's spinning pile driver. He was also fairly quick too. You didn't see too many big guys throughout the King of Fighters series, let alone big guys who were as agile as he was. Speaking of Mark of the Wolves, Terry Bogard no longer has his familiar cap and red jacket, instead rocking his brown jacket from that game. Taizak wasn't the only Mark of the Wolves connection in the game either. Gato, a martial artist who also made his debut in the game, would join with Billy Kane and Ryuji Yamazaki, both of them returning to the series storyline for the first time since '97 to form the Outlaw team. It was pretty cool to see the Mark of the Wolves characters in the series for the first time, and this led fans to speculate that Rock Howard, a fan favorite character from the game, will be making his King of Fighters debut in the next game, especially since he had already appeared in Capcom vs. SNK 2. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the case. Although he did appear in the Maximum Impact games, he wouldn't make his series debut proper until King of Fighters 14, which was 13 years later, and as a downloadable character no less. Anthena was another longtime character whose team would see a shakeup. After leaving Team Psycho Soldier, she would join up with Hinako Shijo, who had debuted in King of Fighters 2000, and a new character named Malin to form the high school girls team. Malin was an energetic young girl that wielded a bladed yo-yo and made use of quick strikes, short-range projectiles, and kicking attacks. When you used her yo-yo attack, it would hang in midair for a few seconds, letting players set traps for their opponent when they try to get too aggressive. In a way, she kinda reminds me of Roland from Street Fighter Alpha. K-Dash, Maxima, and Whip will return to form Team K-Dash. While their role in this game was diminished compared to the NES saga, it was still cool to have these characters remain part of the franchise. Jun Hoon, returning to the series storyline from King of Fighters 2000, will replace Choi on Team Korea, thereby making this year's team consist of himself, Kim Kapwan, and Chang. Blue Mary would join up with Mai Shiranu and King to form this year's women's team. This will be the first time she would join the team, and will be the first time that her and Mai, the two leading ladies of Fatal Fury, will be on the same team together. Team Japan would consist of Benimaru, Goro, and Shingo. Where was Kyo? I'll get to that in a minute. It wasn't all new teams and lineups, however. The Akari Warriors and Art of Fighting teams went back to their King of Fighters 96 lineups, with the former consisting of Ralph, Clark, and Leona, and the latter consisting of Ryo and Yuri Sakazaki, along with Robert Garcia. So what about Kyo? And for that matter, what about his rival, Iori? Well, once again, the two were edit-only characters. But unlike King of Fighters 99 and 2000, they will both have a much bigger role to play. You see, there was a secret team that these two were a part of, but you couldn't immediately see it on the character select screen. The third character was a bit of a surprise. But for now, I want to talk about the bosses. If you recall from King of Fighters 2002, a variant of Kyo was introduced that was called Kusanagi. This was an evil version of him with red eyes, a slightly altered version of his King of Fighters 95 costume and moveset. It was thought that he was just another Nest experiment. However, King of Fighters 2003 would introduce him to the series as a creation of the Yata Mirror, and you would have to fight him as a mid-boss, officially making him part of the series canon. If you keep up with King of Fighters lore, the Yata Mirror should be familiar to you, but we'll get to that in a minute. If you defeat Kusanagi with a super special move, then later you will go on to the game's true final boss and ending. At the end, you faced off against a character called Mukai, who was a character with stone-like skin. No doubt he was your typical SNK hard opponent. Still, I felt that his look didn't really fit in with your usual SNK boss fare. Almost like he would fit in more with a Capcom game, or maybe even Tekken. But again, he was big, he had powerful moves, and he was tough to beat. So yeah, he was an SNK boss. Before Mukai, however, there was another sub-boss that you would have to face. And it was a familiar opponent. Somewhat. This opponent? Maki Kagura. This is another name that should be familiar to anyone who knows King of Fighters lore. She was the deceased older sister of Chizuru, whom she would fight alongside during the match. Indeed, her moveset is basically a more powerful version of Chizuru's. So yeah, Chizuru is back, and this is the first time that she's a playable character in the series canon since King of Fighters 97. And once again, she's one of the co-hosts of the tournament. Turns out, she's being brainwashed by Mukai and his henchmen and forced to use the Yata Mirror, which is her clan's sacred artifact. Both Kusanagi and Maki were creations of this mirror. She will be available as a hidden character in the game, and if you select her, Kyo, and Iori, then you basically reform the 3 Sacred Treasures team from King of Fighters 97. You could then play through the game with this team to see the game's true ending, but we'll get to that in a second. So what if you didn't defeat Kusanagi the right way? Well, after a few more fights, you were transported to the Sky Noah, another name that should be familiar for longtime fans. You see, this was Rugo's base. However, he'd been dead since King of Fighters 95. His only appearances since then were out of continuity. So who exactly was running the show this time? Or rather, who else was running the show? It was then that players would meet the tournament's other co-host, Rose and Adelheid, which was Rugo's daughter and son. You would then fight against Adelheid, who had a moveset similar to his father. If you defeated him, you will receive a generic bad ending. His next appearance will be in King of Fighters 11 as a mid-boss. Sadly, not much was done with him after these games. While he would make an appearance in King of Fighters 13, it would only be in the game's story mode via cutscenes, where it was revealed that his sister Rose was hosting the tournament while under mind control. But we'll talk more about that when we get to King of Fighters 13. It would seem that personality-wise, he's the opposite of his father, and he works to help those whom his father's actions have affected. Matter of fact, in King of Fighters 13, he helps Hydern get to the bottom of the enemy's plot. Still, like with the Flying Brigand subplot, you get the feeling that something more was planned. SNK seemingly missed an opportunity to do something more of his character. Here's hoping that with Rugal returning as a King of Fighters 15 DLC character, maybe we might be seeing Edelheid again in the near future. No doubt, Edelheid confronting his father would be a sight to see. But that's enough for that. During the game's storyline, we will learn that Mukai worked for an organization called Those from the Past, or his distant land as they were sometimes called, and they were the ones behind the tournament along with the game's events. Mukai was just a foot soldier, and it was clear that not only was he acting on his own, but there was someone higher than him on the totem pole. There were also hints that the group was attempting to restore Orochi, or at least steal his power. Perhaps most disturbingly, it would seem that Ash, our new hero, was a part of this group. If you beat the game with the Sacred Treasures team, he would attack Chizuru and steal the Yata mirror along with her power. This would cause her to be injured, and with that, it would be another 19 years before we saw her as a playable character in the storyline again. So what did people think about King of Fighters 2003? The game received fairly positive news in gaming media. Famitsu gave it a 7.1 out of 10, while Defunct Games gave it a B+. It seemed people liked the new mechanics, along with the fact that there were Mark of the Wolves characters in the game. I personally enjoyed the game too, and I felt that the game's atmosphere was much livelier and colorful than the Nest arc. Plus, Ash was different. You didn't see characters like him in fighting games back then, and you don't see characters like that nowadays either. It will be fun to see his character arc progress as the saga moved forward. The game's sprites and backgrounds did a great job pushing the aging Neo Geo hardware to the limit, and the tag shift system kept the gameplay feeling new and fresh. Back then, I was excited to see where the storyline was going to go next, and the game still feels fun and unique as I played it to gather footage for this video. The game will receive a Neo Geo arcade and home release. Not only would it be the last King of Fighters game to be released on the Neo Geo hardware, but it will be the last game to feature its year in the title. Later games in the series will use newer hardware and abandon the yearly naming convention, but we'll talk about that in the next entry. The game would come to PlayStation 2 and Xbox as part of a double pack, which also includes King of Fighters 2002. The home versions have options for traditional 3-on-3 matches, along with a survival mode, a gallery, and a color edit mode. The survival mode even allowed players to unlock character endings in the gallery. The game also lets you unlock the bosses as playable characters. In addition to that, the games have an option to choose between the traditional Neo Geo graphics and a newer graphical style which uses 3D polygons and takes advantage of the console hardware. You also have an option to choose between the original and an arranged version of the soundtrack. For a while, you could even play the Xbox version of the game online via Xbox Live. If you want to play King of Fighters 2003, these versions are definitely the way to go. It's strange that SNK never re-released these versions in any way, either making them available through the PSN shop or make them backward compatible on Xbox One. Alas, you'll have to do some searching on eBay. Or get your Jack Sparrow on if you catch my drift. If you want to play the original arcade version, of course, it's available as part of Hamster's Arcade Archives, the Neo Geo collection, on pretty much most modern gaming consoles. When we last left off, our new hero Ash seemingly showed his true colors. He would attack Chizuru, stealing both her powers along with the Yata Mirror artifact. Meanwhile, an all-new organization, those from the past were starting to make their move. Mukai, who is the final boss of the last game, stole the Orochi seal and broke it. These events will leave the ending of the 2003 tournament in a state of confusion and mystery.
Behind the scenes, SNK was making a number of changes, not only to King of Fighters, but the hardware that was powering it too. The very next mainline entry in this series would abandon the yearly naming format. It would see SNK leave behind the aging Neo Geo hardware. Fans had no clue what was going to happen next, but one thing was for sure. Whether it was in storyline or out of it, King of Fighters was about to change in a big way. While SNK had stopped making the Neo Geo home consoles in 1997, the company would continue to make software utilizing the Neo Geo arcade board well into the early 2000s. The final game that utilized the platform was Samurai Shodown 5 Special, which was released in 2004. Games that were released during this 7-year period would push the system to its limits in terms of graphical effects, sound, and animation. Still, the hardware was showing its age. Remember, the Neo Geo was a 4th generation console that was first released in 1990. This was the period of the Sega Mega Drive and the Nintendo Super Famicom. By the time King of Fighters 2003 was released, gaming had been well into Generation 6 with the Sony PlayStation 2, Nintendo GameCube, Microsoft's Xbox, and the late Sega Dreamcast. Not only that, the software piracy scene was taking a bite out of SNK's profits, even before the bankruptcy and re-emergence as SNK Playmore. It was becoming clear that SNK had to sunset the aging hardware. The next entry of the King of Fighters series would be the spin-off game, Maximum Impact. Maximum Impact, developed by Noise Factory, was SNK's first attempt at a 3D fighter since the PlayStation game, Samurai Shodown Warrior's Rage. And obviously, because it was 3D, it didn't use the Neo Geo hardware. I'll give the Maximum Impact games their own video. Around this time, however, SNK had signed a deal with the Sammy Corporation, who had recently merged with Sega. This deal would allow the use of Sammy's Adams Wave arcade board for a number of SNK games, including what was at the time King of Fighters 2004, which would eventually become known as the King of Fighters 11. The Adams Wave platform was a custom-built arcade board that utilized interchangeable cartridges similar to the Neo Geo. Its hardware was on par to Sega's Naomi board, itself on par with the Sega Dreamcast. Not only did the board feature interchangeable cartridges, it also featured interchangeable modules for different control schemes, such as dual joysticks, a steering wheel, and a light gun. The hardware was utilized on a number of arcade titles, including Guilty Gear Isuka from Arc Systems Works, and Sammy's own Rumblefish. Again, I might have to do a deep dive in the arcade board as well. SNK would produce 5 games that utilized the hardware: Neo Geo Battle Coliseum, Metal Slug 6, Samurai Shodown 6, King of Fighters Neo Wave, and yes, this too is going to get its own video, and of course, King of Fighters 11. No longer held back by aging hardware or an annual release schedule, SNK was free to run wild and create the ultimate King of Fighters. We would see the effects of this new strategy, beginning with King of Fighters 11. The King of Fighters was back, and with a new system powering it, it will look better than ever. The gameplay built upon the tag team mechanics in King of Fighters 2003, and it would introduce even more gameplay features, namely the skill gauge. Along with the usual super meter, there was a secondary meter that will fill up during battle. As this meter filled, you will gain up to 2 skill points that can then be used by mechanics like the saving shift, which prevents you from taking damage while tagging out, the quick shift, which cancels a move while tagging out, and a dream cancel, which lets the team leader cancel a super special move into a leader super special. The roster would go through some changes too. This being King of Fighters, this was a given, but if you like the crazy lineups of King of Fighters 2003, you'll love the lineups that were in this game. Many new characters from other SNK franchises would make their debut, while other characters would make their return. Let's start with Team Fatal Fury. Last time, Andy Bogart was left to the side and replaced with Taizok. This time, Team Fatal Fury will consist of Terry Bogard, Kim Kap-Hwan, and Duck King, a classic Fatal Fury character making his King of Fighters debut for the very first time. As for Taizok, he would join with fellow Mark of the Wolves alumni, Gato and Bijane, with the latter making her King of Fighters debut for the Mark of the Wolves team. Sai Kensu will return to King of Fighters after sitting out King of Fighters 2003 and rejoin Anthena in Team Psycho Soldier. Shin, however, will be replaced with an all-new character, Momoko. Momoko was a young Chinese girl who fought with Capoeira, the Brazilian martial art which was based on dance. As for Marlin, who was introduced in the last game, she would have a beef with Yuri Sakazaki, who apparently made disparaging remarks about her fighting style. Joining with Eiji Kisaragi, who will return to King of Fighters story for the first time since '95, and Kasumi Toto, herself returning to the series storyline since King of Fighters 2000, she would form the Anti-Art of Fighting team. Nessa and Ramon will return to King of Fighters after sitting out 2003. However, this time Seth was nowhere to be found, and instead the two would join with Fatal Fury's Blue Mary to form the Agents team. With Leona recovering from briefly losing control in King of Fighters 2003, Whip will rejoin Ralph and Clark in the Akari Warriors team. Meanwhile, Kula Diamond will return to King of Fighters to take her place alongside K-Dash and Maxima. King would join alongside Ryo and Yuri Sakazaki in the Art of Fighting team. Although this wasn't as earth-shattering as some of the other new lineups, it was still a different look for the crew. With Chizuru having been injured at the end of King of Fighters 2003, and Irie next in Ash's crosshairs, Shingo would take her place alongside Kyo and Irie for the Kusanagi Yagami Alliance team. As for Ash, Duo Lon will leave his side after feeling betrayed by his actions. He will be replaced by Oswald, an older gentleman who fought with playing cards, similar to X-Men's Gambit. Shenwu would still remain by his side. As for Duo Lon himself, he and Benimaru would team up with another all-new character, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a classy French woman who knew Ash when they were kids, yet was still prepared to face him one day. These three would form the Rivals team, although you would wonder if Elizabeth was the true hero of the Ash story arc. King of Fighters 11 is perhaps one of my favorite games in this series, if for no other reason than the off-the-wall team lineups that were in this entry. It felt like SNK simply threw things at the wall just to see what would stick, and I loved it. As an unfortunate consequence, however, this will be the first time in the series that there would be no all-women's team, and with Kim on Team Fatal Fury, there would be no Team Korea either. In addition, several longtime characters, such as Mai and Robert, would find themselves on the sidelines, at least in the arcade version. In the PlayStation 2 version, however, you can unlock not only these two, but you can also unlock Fatal Fury's Tung Fu Rue, Geese Howard, and Mark of the Wolves Hotaru. You can also find Art of Fighting's boss Mr. Big, and a version of Kyo with his Nest Saga moveset, this being called EX Kyo. Most of these characters were based on their Neo Geo Battle Coliseum movesets and sprites. In addition to those characters, there are a number of hidden mid-bosses that you can encounter if you met certain conditions. It seemed that some of the people who worked on this game were fans of obscure fighting games, Baruki 1 and Savage Reign, as some of the mid-bosses were from these games. By default, you would run into Adelheid Bernstein from the previous game if you didn't meet any special conditions. However, depending on your actions before the 4th stage, you would run into either Gai Tendo, Silver, Sho Hayate, and Jaizu, with the former two being from Baruki 1 and the latter two coming from Savage Reign. And there were the bosses, of which there were two. First, you had to contend with Xian, who was a Chinese man who fought with a spear. As you can see from his design, he's quite androgynous. I'd forgive you if you thought you were facing a woman when you first encountered him. His stage, a burning Chinese temple, looked awesome, and the music behind it fit perfectly. Of course, his spear attacks will cause you some serious havoc. And once you made it past them, it was time to face Magaki, the game's final boss. In true SNK fashion, he's hard as hell, and he has attacks that can blast a whole entire screen. The game would hit Japanese arcades in 2005. The next year would see an international release, along with a release on the Japanese PS2. The PlayStation 2 version would come to Europe and North America in 2007, thanks to Ignition Entertainment. At first, this would seem like a somewhat puzzling move, as the PlayStation 3 had released the previous year. However, keep in mind that at the time, the PlayStation 3 models were still backwardly compatible with PlayStation 2 games. Therefore, fans who didn't upgrade yet could still be able to enjoy the game. And since it was only $20, they could enjoy it on the cheap. Sadly, the game wouldn't see any kind of re-release of any kind. While it would come to the Japanese PlayStation Network in 2014, that would be it. So if you want to play this yourself, you're either going to have to do some hunting on eBay, or get your Jack Sparrow on if you catch my drift. If you do decide to go a more legal route, the game will fetch you an average of $21 to $30 on eBay. Maybe one day SNK will give us a re-release with online play, just like they're doing with King of Fighters 13. As for the game itself, it would generally be well received throughout the fan base and the gaming media, with many praising its roster and graphics, and with outlets such as IGN praising the cutscenes and the menus. The main criticism was toward the use of sprites, and even then, critics weren't too harsh about it. Of course, there was also criticism about how absurdly powerful that the bosses were, but this was an SNK game, so that's a given. I'm not going to hit you with the old "get good" line, but complaining about a SNK fighting game having a difficult boss is like complaining about water being wet. All in all, with its low price and abundance of content, it gave players the most bang for their buck. In the week of its Japanese release, it was the only PlayStation 2 game that was on Japanese sales charts, the only ever exception being Konami's football game, Winning 11-10. The King of Fighters 11 would end with another shocking event. Shion, who had been exiled to another dimension after being defeated, would kill off Magaki, who had betrayed him. As for our heroes, Ari would find himself attacked by Ash Crimson. Ash would then steal Ari's flame abilities, leaving him powerless. Although he would fare better than Chizuru, this would still lead to a change in the character. Thus, Kyokusanagi, the last of the three sacred treasures, would become the next target of both Ash and those from the past. Things were being set up for the resolution, which would come 2 entries later, as King of Fighters 12 would be a dream match. This entry would utilize another new arcade board and a new art style. So if you want to learn more about it, just go back and watch the second to last entry in the list, in which I covered the dream matches. For the next video, however, we'll take a look at King of Fighters 13, and we'll learn how SNK closed out the Ash Saga. This next entry will see the return of some old allies, including a few surprise faces. Things are going to be coming to a head for all involved, and I can't wait for you to see it. When King of Fighters 11 ended, things had turned up to a fever pitch. Ash Crimson had obtained both the Kagura clan's Yata Mirror and the Yagami Flame, leaving Kyokusanagi, the third of the sacred treasures, next on the hit list. The mysterious organization known as Those from the Past were attempting to break the seal on Orochi, and the three sacred treasures, Chizuru Kagura, Iori Yagami, and Kyokusanagi, were the latest descendants of the three clans that sealed the demon god away. Naturally, these three stood in the way. Things were coming to a head for King of Fighters, and soon we will find out just what Those from the Past, along with Ash Crimson, were planning. Behind the scenes, however, there was another shakeup when it came to the tech that powered the game. So before we talk about King of Fighters 13 and the end of the Tales of Ash Saga, let's talk about the change in technology. After King of Fighters 11, SNK will leave behind the Adams Wave board for another arcade platform, the Taito Type X2 hardware. 12 wouldn't be the first game which utilized the board, as King of Fighters Maximum Impact Regulation A, an arcade iteration of the Maximum Impact sub-series, was released in 2008 for Japanese arcades. And I know I keep saying this, but I swear that I'm going to give the Maximum Impact series its own video one day. The upgrade between these two platforms was even more apparent than the upgrade between the Neo Geo and the Adams Wave board. The Taito Type X family of arcade hardware, created by game developer and publisher Taito, utilized a personal computer style setup with each iteration of the hardware utilizing a form of embedded windows. Rather than being based on a singular hardware architecture, the system featured a modular platform that allowed developers to choose a configuration scheme that best fits the requirements of their game. Thus, developers had better flexibility when making their games. Think of this in comparison to, say, the Data East Deco, the Neo Geo, or even the Adams Wave arcade board. Although these three systems utilize interchangeable components for their games, you were still hard-locked into whatever the hardware was capable of performance-wise. While the Taito Type X still had limits depending on the version, it was possible for developers to make games with different scalability requirements. In layman's terms, this meant that games could use as much or as little resources as needed. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the board, as much of this is another story for another time, and this is about SNK and King of Fighters. Also, I don't want to bore you with too much tech mumbo jumbo, but suffice it to say that the board gained a lot of popularity throughout the 2000s and 2010s, and it's still in use today, with the current version being Type X4. I can show you 5 different games that utilize some form of the hardware, and unless you were into software engineering, you wouldn't believe that they all use the same framework. I might go into a deep dive about the board later on in another video. But for now, as loath as I am to talk about it, I'm going to have to talk about King of Fighters 12 again. After King of Fighters 11, SNK wanted an all-out graphical overhaul, as confirmed by longtime KOF illustrator Nona. Whereas King of Fighters 11's art style was similar to that of the Neo Geo, with several characters even reusing Neo Geo sprites, King of Fighters 12 would see SNK's artists redraw the characters from scratch. There was some confusion among the fan base when SNK Overseas manager Yoshihito Koyama stated that the game was going to be 3-dimensional mixed with 2-dimensional. This led to some concern that the game was going to be cel-shaded or even 3D. While fans probably wouldn't have minded a cel-shaded game, 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional fighting games tended to get a bad rap. Thankfully, it appears he was actually referring to the character design process, which utilized a mixture of 3D modeling and 2-dimensional art. There's also misconception throughout the fan base that SNK simply made 3D models and traced over them. However, there's much more to it than that. You see, first Nona would create the character graphics in dot pixel form, then the artists at SNK would create 3D models that are based on these designs. After giving the 3D models the moves and animations that they're going to have in the game, the 3D models are then converted back to 2D, then sent back to Nona to apply the finishing touches. So while 3D modeling does play a part in the animation, at the end of the day it's still hand-drawn art with no cel shading, as confirmed by SNK producer Masaki Kukino. And I know I mispronounced that name. Speaking of 3D, SNK stated that they had no intention of ever taking the series to the 3rd dimension. I'm sure this statement will age well. Anyway, as much as I rag on King of Fighters 12, You can't deny that it had some beautiful looking graphics. There was a drawback though. Due to all the time it took in development, SNK's artists would spend 16 to 17 months on a character. This is why 12 had the smallest roster in the series, as it was basically a glorified tech demo. But with King of Fighters 13, SNK would have the kinks worked out, and the game would close out the Ash story arc in an epic manner. After the chaotic events of the last game, there was a lot of speculation and confusion as to what would happen next, or if there would even be a tournament. Thankfully, Rose Adelheid is on hand to announce the start of the new tournament, and all is well, or at least all seems to be. Yeah, there is something going behind the scenes, but we're just glad King of Fighters is back. In a way, the game's story can be considered a parallel to the real-world happenings of King of Fighters at the time. After King of Fighters 12 turned out to be a shit show, people were concerned about the direction the series would go next. Then suddenly, SNK Playmore announces King of Fighters 13, and all is well. And if the game's ending was anything to go by, the next entry will be something of a reboot, or at least a jumping on point for new fans. King of Fighters 13 will be released in Japanese arcades in 2010, with PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 releases in late 2011 worldwide. The 360 version was backwardly compatible on the Xbox One and Series X. These home versions would introduce DLC characters for the very first time, along with an alternate soundtrack, Type B, that featured remixes of classic King of Fighters tunes. The game would also feature redrawn versions of classic stages, such as Iori's King of Fighters 95 stage and the Pow Pow Cafe from Fatal Fury. A PC version would come to Steam in 2013 and GOG.com in 2018. The game is also coming to PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch in the near future in a port entitled Global Match, which features online play with rollback netcode. There's also a mobile version, but that had different gameplay and less content, so I won't discuss that version. King of Fighters 13 was made with longtime fans in mind, almost to a fault. If you love the tag team mechanic from the past two games, you're going to be disappointed, as the matches were back to classic 3-on-3 elimination. There are some substantial tweaks from King of Fighters 12. 13 introduced EX special moves, which are powered up versions of regular special moves that used one section of a super meter. This expanded to EX versions of the super attacks, which would use two stocks of a super meter. Another new tactic introduced in this game is the drive cancel feature, in which players can cancel one attack into another by entering the commands for the new attack while the first one was still active. This made use of the hyperdrive meter, as the cancels would slowly drain it. When the hyperdrive gauge was full, players could utilize what was called hyperdrive mode. This allowed players to pull off an unlimited amount of drive cancels for a short amount of time. The hyperdrive mode also allowed players to use the Neo Max Super Special move with only 2 power stock meters instead of 3 in normal mode. However, not every character had a Neo Max. This old school spirit also expanded to the roster. Again, if you like the zany lineups in King of Fighters 2003 and 11, prepare to be disappointed. On the other hand, if you are a fan of some of the game's classic lineups, prepare to be delighted. Let's start with Team Fatal Fury. After previous games seeing the likes of Duck King, Taizak, and Kim Cap-Wan join the team, along with Terry rocking his brown jacket, Team Fatal Fury was back to Terry, Andy, and Joe, with Terry back in his familiar red jacket and cap. Sadly, there's not a single Mark of the Wolves fighter to be found outside of story mode cutscenes, which I'll get to in a little bit. Takuma will return to the storyline for the first time since King of Fighters 2001, teaming up with his son Ryo Sakazaki and student Robert Garcia to reform the classic version of Team Art of Fighting, last seen in King of Fighters 95. Of course, this meant that Robert Garcia shaved his badass goatee that he had in King of Fighters 11. As for Yuri, she would rejoin King and Mai, reforming the classic version of the Women Fighters team which hadn't been seen since King of Fighters 95. Shin would also rejoin the game's cast and make his very first appearance in the Tales of Ash story arc. He would, of course, reunite with Sai Kensu and Anthena to reform the classic version of Team Psycho Soldier. Leona, having regained composure since 2003, would rejoin Clark and Ralph to reform the 95 Ikari Warriors team. This wasn't that much surprising of a lineup, as the three had last appeared in King of Fighters 2003, so this lineup was still pretty recent. Also, Benimaru and Goro would rejoin Kyo to reform the classic Team Japan. Now, that's not to say there weren't any surprises though. Kim Kap-Hwan would have his own team once again, but instead of joining with his longtime partners Chang and Choi, sometimes partner Jun, or even Mei Lee, he would team up with Raiden and Hwa Jai. Raiden, who had already debuted in King of Fighters 12, was a professional wrestler character who made his debut in the very first Fatal Fury game. Raiden was his heel persona. After being defeated, future games in the series would see him remove his mask and go under the name Big Bear, which was his face persona. By the way, if you're not into pro wrestling, face means good guy and heel means bad guy. Raiden's design was inspired by the late great Leon White, who wrestled under the name Big Van Vader. Hwa Jai, on the other hand, was another Fatal Fury alumni who made his debut in the original Fatal Fury also. King of Fighters 13 marked the very first time he would show up in the roster of a fighting game since then. Not only that, with the exception of the SNES port of the original Fatal Fury, this would be his first time as a playable character. Hwa Jai was a Muay Thai fighter who acted as Joe Higashi's rival and sought to dethrone him. In King of Fighters 13, the two would team up with Kim in order to boost their reputations as fighters, and to prove to Choi and Chang that they were better at pranking Kim. As for Kyo's rival, as this roster was focused on classic lineups, Mature and Vice will return from the dead as ghosts that can materialize as physical beings in the world of the living. Yeah, it was a cheesy excuse, but whatever worked, right? So Eerie, Vice, and Mature were a team in the storyline once again for the very first time since King of Fighters 96. Remember, every other time they appeared in King of Fighters was as part of a dream match. Surprisingly, K-Dash, Kula, and Maximum were the only team from King of Fighters 11 that didn't see any alteration. Of course, this meant that poor Whip had to sit this one out. When we last left off with Ash, Oswald, and Shin Woo, Ash had left his two former teammates to fight each other to the death. As Oswald is nowhere to be found, one has to assume the worst. Shin Woo, however, would leave Ash's side, replacing Benimaru on the rivals team, teaming up with Elizabeth and reuniting with Dio Lan. Speaking of Ash, he would be an edit-only character in the game. It's only natural, right? How else he's going to carry out his plan? This entry would introduce downloadable content to the series for the first time, at least in the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 version of the game. For a small fee, players can purchase EX Kyo, which is Kyo with his Nest Saga moveset, Iori with the power of the flames, which was basically Iori with his classic moveset, and Mr. Karate. Mr. Karate was an alter ego used by Takuma in the original Art of Fighting. This was basically a more powerful version of his regular moveset. You can also purchase an instant unlock for the game's mid-bosses, Saiki and classic Fatal Fury villain Billy Kane. Keep in mind, however, you can encounter and unlock these two normally by playing the game. By the way, who was Saiki? We'll get to him in a moment. In the Steam, GOG, and upcoming PlayStation 4 and Switch version of the game, all of the downloadable content will be included. Keep in mind, this game is the end part of a story arc that lasted nearly 8 years long and was left in the air for nearly half a decade. If you weren't already up to speed on the game's events, or you were new to the series, you definitely wanted to consult a wiki before jumping into this game. Otherwise, you might be lost when it comes to some of the story's concepts. Of course, you can also watch the last few episodes of my King of Fighters retrospective. Hint hint. But while the story may be too hard to just jump into, you won't have as much trouble picking up on the game's mechanics thanks to the comprehensive tutorial and mission modes. These two modes do a good job of letting new players pick up on the fundamentals on their own pace. The tutorial mode teaches you the basics of the system, while the mission mode drills you through character-specific tasks that help you master their movesets and combos. The mission mode also contains the survival and time trial modes. Along with the standard arcade mode, there's a story mode which fleshes out the game's plot. There are several dialogue-heavy scenes, and at certain points, you pick a team and have to battle, and at times you'll also have to pick from two choices. The choices you make, along with winning or losing certain battles, can affect the plot. In a way, you can see that SNK picked up some tricks from more modern games like BlazBlue, at least when it comes to single-player content. The arcade mode is the same as it ever was. You pick your team, and you fight through several opponents, hoping to make it to the true final boss and see your team's true ending. Like in King of Fighters 2003, you need to score a certain amount of points if you want to have a chance to see the true ending. In this case, you need 2.5 million by the end of Battle 6. During single-player matches, players are challenged to pull off random tasks. These tasks, called target actions, range from performing a move a certain amount of times to pulling off his combo with a certain amount of hits in a short period of time. Completing these actions can earn you bonus points. In addition, completing a certain amount of target actions per match in the arcade mode allows you to fight against either Billy Kane or Saiki as a mid-boss. Another cool thing in the game's arcade mode is that before each fight, there's dialogue between the two combatants. There's dialogue for every combination of characters. The game also features a customization mode where you can edit a character's color palette. What's cool about this mode is that some characters have a hidden alternate costume that you can discover in this mode, among them being Raiden's Big Bear mask and Elizabeth's King of Fighters XI outfit. At long last, the man behind the group, those from the past, will be revealed finally. A mysterious man named Saiki. His plot was to travel to the future, which is the modern day, and steal the power of Orochi to replenish their army. This in turn would allow them to destroy their enemies before they become a threat. If you satisfy certain conditions during the arcade mode, you could face him in his human form as a mid-boss. Most likely when you battle against him, you'll fight him in his overpowered awakened form, which is a giant red demon. When you reach the end of stage 6, provided you fulfill the 2.5 million points requirement, time stops, and you are once again confronted by those from the past, this time accompanied by their boss. You then get to witness Saiki heartlessly murder Mugaki for disobeying him. You remember Mugaki, right? You see, Saiki views his subordinates as indispensable pawns. After that demonstration, you then get transported to a hellish subspace to battle Saiki's awakened form. In true SNK boss fashion, it's frustratingly difficult. However, when you defeated this awakened Saiki, he had one more surprise. Ash Crimson would make a last-ditch effort to stop his plan, and that's when Saiki would take him over. You would then fight this evil-possessed Ash in one final battle for the fate of all space and time. King of Fighters 13 was praised across the board by gaming media and fighting game fans alike. The major criticism was that the game was geared toward longtime fans and wasn't exactly accessible to newbies, but this is King of Fighters, so you'd expect that. It's highly regarded throughout the fan base as one of the best entries in the series, if not the best, and it's easy to see why. The graphics and animation are gorgeous, and the gameplay is on point. The music is a great throwback to earlier King of Fighters games. Again, if you like the crazy lineups from 2003 and 11, the rosters are a bit of a letdown. Then again, this is a package geared toward old school fans, and if that was you, you're going to enjoy this. And with the game headed to Switch and PlayStation 4, even more players will soon have the chance to experience this game. King of Fighters 13 would bring the tale of Ash to an end. It would turn out that Saiki was Ash's ancestor. Once you defeated the possessed Ash, he would use his free will to hold Saiki at bay. This prevented the two from entering the gate. Had they been able to do so, Saiki would have been able to return to the past and reset his plan once again. However, this time, with the gate closed, Saiki was prevented from returning to the past, meaning that he would soon be erased from existence. However, this also meant that Ash too would be gone. You see, since Saiki was his ancestor, if he doesn't exist, Ash wouldn't have been born. So it turns out Ash Crimson was a hero after all. He just had a different way of moving. One wonders what would have happened if he had been straight up with everyone. Maybe they could have all worked together to come up with a plan to stop those from the past without things reaching the 11th hour the way they did. Then again, that wouldn't be our Ash, would it? At the end, Ken Folk was willing to take himself out of existence to save the world and possibly all of time and space. It doesn't get much more heroic than that. So that was it for those from the past. Though Xion from King of Fighters 11 along with Botan and some of the associates were still out in the wild, the main figureheads were dead, and in Saiki's case, wiped out of existence completely. Even his memory began to disappear. Sadly, Ash too was gone. Or was he? See, there was something about Ash. You saw how he operated throughout the saga. He was out here playing Crusader Kings 3 while everyone else, from Hydern to even his affiliates and those from the past, were playing Hungry Hungry Hippos. He had plans on top of plans. Even if some of them involved doing people dirty, including his own friend Elizabeth, it was all for the greater good. Call me crazy, but I don't think something as small as being wiped from existence is going to be enough to stop him. I don't think we've seen the last of our man Mr. Crimson. I'm not into conspiracy theories, but if Ash pops up again, I wouldn't be surprised. But for now, that's it for the Tales of Ash Saga. It's a good thing I originally did these videos separately. As you can see, this is the longest entry yet, clocking in at around an hour. The script for King of Fighters 13 alone was over 6 pages. Still, it was all worth it. You know I love King of Fighters, and hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, do me a solid and hit that like button. Also, make sure you share this video and let your friends know about it. And don't forget to let me know what you think in the comments. If you're new to the channel, I like to cover retro games, indie titles, and game-related tech. I do everything from reviews, the previews, the tech unboxings, and even documentaries, just like the one you just finished watching. If that sounds good to you, join the Mafia. All you gotta do is hit that subscribe button, and like that, I'll make you a made man. Easiest choice in your life, right? If you want to do me one better, turn your notifications on. That way, you'll be the first to know whenever I drop a new video. A majority of people who watch my content aren't subscribed, so let's change that. I get some engagement, I know you like these videos, and you get to be the first to watch them. Everybody wins, right? But enough of that. In the next entry, we're heading straight into the modern saga with King of Fighters 14. This entry introduced a number of changes for the series, and there are a bunch of new faces added to the cast too. It's going to be a while before I drop it because I got tons of other videos in the works. In the meantime, have a great day, enjoy the rest of your week, thanks for watching, and I'm Audi 51000G.